Welcome everyone to Yachting International Radio. I have two fabulous guests with me today. I've got Sandra, the Yacht Purser, and Megan from the Sunday London Times magazine. Welcome both of you. Now, Megan wrote an article called The Secret World of Yachting and What It's Really Like to Work on Board. So before we begin and go into that, if you can both introduce yourself, and that gives the audience a better understanding of your expertise.
So as Corinne said, I am commissioning editor at the Sunday Times magazine and also a feature writer. I sort of tend to specialize in stories about women and have written about sexual harassment before. And I was drawn to the story initially because a friend had worked in the industry. And I'd heard bits and pieces about the struggles that specifically young women are under and the pressures that they're under. And then the more I found out about it, the more I realized that, okay, sure, I don't write the headlines, but the secretive world sounds, it's a good headline, right? From you and when you're on the inside, it feels normal and it feels natural. And as somebody looking in, the yachting world is so individual. Nothing else is like it. It is so difficult to understand and explain. So it kind of is a bit of a secretive world. There were lots of people that when I asked them questions would laugh at me because they thought that this thing was so obvious. This thing that like everyone in the yachting industry thinks of as like, yeah, it's normal, or I can't believe you don't know that. For an outsider, it's like mind-blowing. That was, I mean, I've never ever seen like a little pod that's so separate to the rest of the working world. It was gathering women's stories month and month. I think there are 3 in there that I told. There were far more. I was just looking through my WhatsApps just now. There are far more women that came to me initially wanting to tell their story and then decided that it felt too frightening or big, which obviously I totally understand. So this wasn't sort of like, this is the small number that actually had the confidence and the legal backing as well, because we have to sort of make sure it's completely legally sound before we print anything. So there were lots more. And afterwards, I know that there was some sort of pushback from the industry who thought that maybe it was sensationalist. But as I said, just looking back through my WhatsApps, the response that I got from the women that I spoke to, specifically whose stories that I told, were positive, and they said, let me see, they said, thank you. I've so enjoyed reading the article. It's probably the most accurate depiction of yachting aimed at the general public, specifics. That's important. I've read. I really appreciate how much time and detail you put into highlighting the unspoken issues of the industry. Finally had the courage to read the article this morning. That was the girl that was raped. So I'm not surprised that it took her a while to read it. Thank you so much. It's so overwhelming to read my own story in print. It certainly feels a lot more real. And it makes it more justified, the emotional damage and turmoil. You've done an amazing thing by writing this, and I hope you've had some positive feedback. I got used to telling the story well. So, I mean, from my point of view, looking back, if the women that I spoke to think that I told their story fairly and accurately and sensitively, then that's kind of enough for me. People might think that I was exaggerating. I'm absolutely not. It's my job to not. So that was very meaningful for me, having those messages.
So why do you think they would respond saying it was sensational to you?
I mean, it hit a nerve. It's frightening. It's frightening to be scrutinized. It's frightening to be criticized. It kind of is, he does protest too much. If the women and other women who have suffered it said, that's it, and everyone else went, oh, no, that's wrong, nothing to see here, it's like, okay, that in itself is like, I don't know, I'm not saying anything, but I thought it was indicative.
And yourself, Sandra, if you can just introduce yourself quickly and maybe respond to why, having worked in the industry, this particular company would say it's sensationalism.
Hey, I am Sandra. I am the Yacht Purser. My background is that I worked in yachts for over 10 years. I worked as a stewardess and then a chief stew over 6.5 years. And then I eventually moved to purser. And I now train yacht pursers. I run the ultimate yacht purser course. And one of the things that I would like to see down the line is on board to be somebody compiling information for crew to help them deal with the kinds of things that they do, but also giving them information about people off the boat, so counseling and support, as well as how to go through the onboard complaints procedure if they have one. So my background too is that I have been subject to that. I've seen it happen firsthand. And for me, being a woman, it's important. I think that I have so many people who come to me with things that have happened on board and things that are being swept under the rug. And I think probably the biggest problem with yachting and why it is such a secretive world is that we all sign these non-disclosure agreements. And so there's this confidentiality aspect to it. We're working for some of the wealthiest, most famous people in the world. And obviously they want to protect their own reputation. So there's this very big stigma against speaking out. And I think that this is one of the problems, is that people think that they can't speak out about something because maybe they'll be sued for it or it goes against the confidentiality agreement. But at the end of the day, you can't have a confidentiality agreement protecting illegal activity. It doesn't work like that. So my big thing is that I want to try and get the correct information to people on board so that they know the steps to take when something happens, whether they are party to it or they witness it. So yeah, I think that's probably where I come from, my position.
Yeah, it's interesting because my time working on board, when we had issues, we were told that there's DPA, and I didn't even know who the DPA was. And then there was a yacht management company, but I felt unsafe to report anything to the yacht management company. I felt like there was collusion with them and the owners or the captain. And what I'm hearing at the moment are victims of these crimes are crying out for help and support, and they feel so alone. And it's about time that we close that gap, as you said, with the right information and the correct reporting procedures, and that everyone is very aware of what they are and how to go about doing it. So yeah, I've got a survey in front of me now, and to give you an example of some of the responses, did the unwanted physical contact come from a fellow crew member or guest on board or both? 49% said crew member, which is very interesting. Guest on board was 12%, both was 8%. And to elaborate a bit on some of the experiences, I'll just randomly select some. The owner started rubbing my shoulders and whispered inappropriate things to me late one night as I was cleaning up. His wife was asleep downstairs. It was only my second year in yachting. I didn't know how to handle the situation. I just froze. Eventually, he left me alone. I told the captain the next day, but he didn't do anything. Out of fear, he'd lose his job. I left the boat at the end of the summer. It happened only once. Today, I would handle it very differently. So that's going back again to collusion and feeling unsupported. Right. So maybe I'll just start off addressing the points made in the article in response to Megan's article. And the first one is, whilst this may be good for reading, it's not entirely accurate and fails to capture the fact that vast majority of crew, including both men and women, have been able to build happy and successful careers in the industry, despite its perceived reputation. So, Sandra, how would you, based on working on board for a very long time and now being shore-based, what do you think the perceived reputation is of the industry?
Don't think so. If you are a young person wanting to get into yachting, right? You see all these Instagram profiles and the boats showing people living their best life and sitting on a beach, sipping cocktails. And so a large majority of people getting into yachting, they don't actually understand what it takes to provide the level of service that is required on board. Okay. You're not working in a McDonald's. You're not working at a Holiday Inn. you're working on one of the most elite assets in the world. You know, you wouldn't just walk into the Ritz-Carlton and be like, oh, give me a job, I'm straight out of high school. Right? There's usually years and years of training that goes into being hired into a place like that. So I think you don't understand that. First of all, it's a very difficult work environment. And second of all, you're in a small space. So there's nowhere to turn to. There's nowhere to run. You're sleeping on board. If something happens on board, people aren't posting and saying, right, I've just had this happen to me. So yes, there's no kind of real sharing of stories for fear of victimization. And I think that's the biggest problem, is that people don't report it, because at the end of the day, they want to still work in the industry. And then if they report it, they're not going to get a reference from the captain and the management company. And it looks, crew agents are like, oh, I'm looking for longevity. And whilst, yes, longevity is great, it still places it still puts the victim in a very difficult position. Do they stay and be subjected to the continuous harassment? All right. Now, I had a successful career on board. Does it mean that I was never harassed or I never experienced feelings of being uncomfortable on board? Of course I did. All right. But I think that where I was successful in that I was able to deal with the very hectic incidences right then and there, whether it was myself or on behalf of somebody else. So I've had a second stewardess who was cornered in a staircase by an owner's brother. All right. What did I do? Well, first of all, she came and she told me there was only 2 of us on board. I was doing a temp job and there was only 2 of us on board. So one of us was on earlies, one of us was on late for that job. I was early. I immediately took her off service. I said, right, you go, you're back of house, you'll do the laundry, you'll do just the things out of the guest's way. I went and I reported it to the captain. And I also said to her, at some point, you are going to have to go into a guest area. I said, please make sure your radio is on. All right. And it wasn't a sexual assault in terms of like taking her into a cabin and raping her, but it could have been down the line, depending on like her reaction to his advances. But obviously there's very different degrees. And when people are inebriated, and just remember that when guests come on board, a lot of them do drink heavily. And so sometimes what they do, they're inebriated. All right. It's the same thing with crew too. They go out, they have a party, they come back, and that's where a lot of the incidents tend to happen. So for me, I raised the issue with the captain. I explained that she wasn't to be alone. If she was in a guest area, that please, the chief officer or somebody needs to know where she is and keep her radio on her. And if anything happens, she's to push down her radio. The incident eventually did actually get raised with the owner, and the owner addressed it with his brother. And there was an apology issued. So in that situation, she did end up staying on the boat. And I don't think the brother came on board again while she was there. And eventually she did leave. But, that for me was at least a good way in which the captain acknowledged what had happened. Crew member felt safe still working on board for that time. And yeah, another situation I had, I was working late and the guests were trying to get me to have a drink with them, which you can't do when you're working. So I'm always like, no, please, I'm not having a drink. I can't, I'm working, I'll get fired. And so you blame it on your captain, you blame it on your position, you blame it on your job. It got to the point where this guest was not taking no for an answer. So I went and I actually knocked on the captain's door. It was late. And I said, listen, this is the situation that's going on. He's like, you're the chief stew, you deal with it. I said, I am. I'm waking the captain up and I'm telling you to deal with it. I don't feel comfortable in this situation with the guests. So he actually did. He got up and he went and he sat with the guests and made jokes with them and entertained them and stuff. And that seemed to appease them. But that's the point. If you do need to stick up for yourself to a certain degree. You need to tell somebody what's happening. And I think for me, it's the way in which you deal with it. All right. So not making a drama out of it. I think that's the biggest issue, is that if it's dealt with in a calm manner, which is difficult because obviously when you're feeling threatened and your emotions are raised, it's difficult to deal with things in a calm manner. But I think having your onboard complaints procedures and understanding who to go to when things happen would be very helpful. And having somebody explain that procedure to you and the timeline that things need to happen in is also something that more awareness should be raised about that.
Okay, thank you. I think what would be so interesting now is for me to share this result of the survey. And there was over 347 people answered this question. If you answered yes to having been the victim of physical or verbal sexual harassment, did you report what you suffered? Do you want to take a guess how many people reported?
Less than 1%.
No, 21%. So it's yeah. But that's 65% though didn't report it. And if you answered no, please provide details as why the sexual harassment was not reported. It is the captain making the comments, because my chief stew said it's the industry and didn't want to get into trouble and said I'm sensitive and should shake it off. I wouldn't have been believed. I did not know who to report it to because I'm new crew and the suspect are old crew members with high positions. I'm afraid no one would believe me. Second, I still need the job to support my family. I'm afraid I'll be fired instead of being sent home too quick. So I keep my mouth shut. Working on yachts is like a dream to me. Again, and so, yeah, I mean, having, like, what are the variables? What gets in the way of people not reporting? It's clearly not knowing how to and the abuse of power.
Mm-hmm. I mean, from my perspective, looking in, what I think is important to make clear is that I don't think that there is necessarily more harassment or that people are bad people that work in the yachting industry. It's just a perfect storm. Not being able to report, being NDA'd up to your eyeballs. So many people couldn't talk to me and Janet. And I'm not surprised they were terrified. They were going to go up against, they went on the record on their names. They might have been going up against some of the richest people in the world, right? Like, obviously, as a newspaper, you back them up. Our legal team, it makes sure that everything that is published pretty much is almost 100% watertight and will obviously, it's their fight in court rather than their sources' fight in court. So that's one thing. Then it's the sort of triangular structure. This is bearing in mind, this is from me looking in, but I think some fresh pairs of eyes can sort of break it down maybe more. Then it was the pyramid structure, that the captain is the one. He is the HR manager, the CEO, the boss. There's sort of no way out of that. Thirdly, it was the crew management companies. Some of them were owned by the owner. Some of them, most people didn't feel backed up by that. And the isolation of being on the boat itself was really difficult. I think sometimes if you're subject to harassment, you need to talk about it and sound it off other people and see their reactions in order for them to say to you, you do realize that that's really not good. Naturally, women lay things down. I don't think that any woman wants to admit that she was raped or assaulted. So that's why they keep it in for a long time, or sometimes it never comes up at all. This isn't something that they want to shout about. This is something that takes a long time to get to grips with. So being on a boat without other people to talk to or without private conversations must be really difficult. And it was just, and then also the sort of lack of a solid authority. I know that there are lots, but it's so complicated to get your head around that actually if you're exhausted or you are a victim of serious sexual assault, when you're depressed or anxious or any of these things, the ability to get your ducks in a row and find out where to go, what to do, it's like overwhelming. So I hope that I'm not trying to say that people who work in the yachting industry are bad people, that they're doing bad things worse than other people in other industries. They're not. It's just the structure that exists around it. It's just really, it just makes it worse. It incubates it. And it makes it hard to report.
Yeah, it's so true. And that's, I think, what Sandra and I are so passionate about in terms of resolving and providing an option or a safe option and a very clear procedure in terms of reporting. And based on the survey, they said that 64% of them reported to their captain or the head of department, 1.18% reported to the flag state. So, Sandra, why would you think that is? why such a low response to reporting to the flag state?
The thing is that first of all, you have to understand that everybody in yachting has heard of the term MLC.
Mm-hmm.
They throw MLC around, Maritime Labour Convention. Okay, now the Maritime Labour Convention was brought about by the ILO, International Labour Organization. Now that it's called the Seafarers' Bill of Rights, right? And it obviously enshrines the fact that you, first of all, as a human being working at sea, have fundamental rights. But MLC only applies to yachts that are 500 gross tons and commercially registered, which is a very small percentage of, if you look at the greater yachting industry, it's actually a very small percentage of yachts. And even if MLC does apply, you still have a contract that you sign, an SEA, and those are the rights that you have, right? So why is the reporting so low to the flag states? Well, first of all, most crew don't know how to raise a complaint with flag, right? Now, in your contract, so usually in your SEA, you will have your MLC contact for your own nationality. So, for example, I'm South African. In my SEA, I would usually have SAMSA, their contact details. Now, if you've ever tried to get hold of somebody there, it's almost impossible. It's like, and also yachting, it is this, in terms of the shipping or seafaring community, it's this tiny little blip on the radar. And a lot of the time, the people who choose to work on yachts, it's a choice. Like you can usually generally choose to leave and go and work in another industry. It's not like somebody working in a fishing vessel and that's their skill or whatever the case may be. So I think that's possibly why flag states don't really, we're small fish in their pond or in their field, you know. So again, then you look at the flag state that you're working on. So if you're working on a UK flag vessel, then to report it to the MCA. If you're working on a Cayman flag vessel, to report it to the Cayman Islands. Now, the Cayman Islands actually you can report things to the shipping master directly. They have a little website form where you can go in and log complaints. All right. Harassment and bullying complaints. They released a survey that they did last year regarding all of their complaints. And harassment and bullying were actually pretty low on their complaints list or reported complaints. And again, it's just, I think down to underreporting because people don't know. I mean, obviously, if your wages aren't being paid, then you're like, right, I need to contact. It's kind of more, all right, my wages haven't been paid. It's not like I'm being discriminated against. You know, that's an okay thing to complain about. But as you say, women, you don't feel comfortable. You don't want to be stigmatized. You don't want to be known as the person who complained against their vessel for being harassed and bullied on board. All right. Because it does kind of carry down with you. And people talk, this industry is so small. So I think down the line, captains they'll ask their friend, oh, you was working on that boat. What do you think of Sandra? Oh, well, she did report that the owner harassed you or whatever. Oh, perhaps we're not going to hire her on board. And that's the problem that people face. That's why they wouldn't report things, because it does affect their future employment down the line.
Yeah. But now with regards to the reporting procedures, there's one issue of knowing how to report it. And the other issue is something actually going to happen. Is there a consequence? Am I protected? And based on these survey results, a lot of people said nothing happened after reporting.
Yeah. But just from, again, each flag state is different. So I can't speak on behalf of flag states, but what I have found is that people who do report this to the flag state, and I have seen the actual complaints that have been raised on board following the official complaints procedure. And if something does happen on board, what do you need to do? Well, you need to start taking down a record of that. So you need to start writing reports, taking a journal, write down, this happened, just factually dated, this entry is completed at this time on this date, right? And then even if you're writing it and emailing it to yourself, you have to have evidence or write up of what happened on board and then sending it to the flag state as it forms part of that record. Obviously, you have an onboard complaints procedure. It does need to first go to the captain. If it is the captain who is the one who's the perpetrator, it needs to go to the DPA or the ship owner, the management company. But again, at the end of the day, I have spoken to certain flag states and talking about getting rid of people. Yes, although you've got clauses in your contract that say you may only be let go in these circumstances of gross misconduct or whatever. In reality, what they have told me personally is you can be fired from a yacht regardless of what you've done. Even if you haven't done anything. They can just let you go as long as they follow the procedure in terms of your notice, paying out your notice or whatever the case may be. They don't need a reason to fire you. That's been their kind of unofficial story from a few flag states. And that is absolutely the problem. Raise a complaint, harassment. Okay, all right, well, it's just easier to get rid of you. And the issue is that cross-border litigation is really difficult. So where do you go? If you wanted to sue somebody or to bring it to court, where would you go? Where would you take it to? Where would you... it's expensive. And again, as Megan said, you're coming up against some of the world's wealthiest people. Companies that yachts are registered, all right, they have a company, usually the yacht's registered under that company. It's usually registered in an offshore location, and the yacht is the only asset in that company. Okay. And again, there's usually yachts have an ultimate beneficial owner. Some flag states require you to register who the ultimate beneficial owner is, because piercing that corporate veil is very difficult. That's why people register companies, to protect the individual shareholders or directors or whatever the case may be. If you've ever read the Panama Papers, or you've watched The Laundromat on Netflix, the reason they do that is to protect themselves, and they hire family officers to protect their assets. So it is very difficult to actually proceed with things like this, with complaints or harassment complaints, and get a result. What result are you looking for? At the end of the day, are you looking to be paid out if you leave because you can't get another job? Are you looking to get that person removed from their position? Again, what you need to also understand, what is the result that you want to see at the end of the day? In international shipping law, there's something called maintenance and cure. So if you're injured on board, the ship owner has the legal obligation to ensure that you are cared for while you're sick, and then also that you're compensated for, so it's the maintenance part, so that you're compensated for the time that you weren't able to work, all right? And there's actually a chef who's won a really pretty big maintenance and cure case in the last year, which was quite telling. They were only looking for around $4,000 to recover their expenses from hospitalization, but I think they got over $1.2 million. Right? So I think, and again, that was for an actual physical ailment. Now, where it comes to the psychological effects of harassment and bullying and assault, because again, assault, that is a crime. Okay, so if you have been sexually assaulted on board, the first place that I would probably go to is the port state. So where are you? Are you in France? Are you in the US? I would go to the local police there and report it there, and then get that port state involved.
Yeah.
What really struck me about the whole industry was exactly that, was the money and the secretiveness of who owned the boats in the first place. And I kind of always knew that it was really difficult to find out who owned boats. I didn't realize that it was impossible. And as a journalist, I like to think that part of my job is putting a magnifying glass up to these people who have the most power in the world and the most money in the world. I just couldn't watch it happen. I mean, you can't just watch that happen. It needs to be scrutinized. It needs to be picked apart and opened out like any government or like any company. I mean, that's why you have business journalism, so that they can, the Panama Papers, like you said, when there's lots of money, there's lots of power that goes alongside it, and that's manipulated. We've seen that lots in the news over the past few years since Me Too. So as a journalist, that's what I wanted to try and work out, and to try and sort of have a little look. I mean, I know that lots of people in the industry will think that I didn't get the details down, or that I misinterpreted it. And that's easy to think when you know the industry very, very well. What I was trying to do was understand. I mean, I was researching this for 6 months. It wasn't a sort of quick turnaround, flashy tabloid headline jobby. But, my aim was to try to let other people know about exactly what Sandra was saying, that secretiveness, which is quite threatening when you're a little guy, when you're basically a freelancer when you're working on a boat. So yeah, that was what I was trying to work out.
So Megan, based on your experience of interviewing the victims, what did you feel? If you were to describe the energy in the room, what were they needing? And yeah, it sounded like a lot of them felt like they didn't have a voice and they couldn't talk. So what was your experience of that?
Well, lots of them, it took a lot of them a while to fully understand what had happened to them because they had just carried on working. A young woman who was raped by a fellow crew member, she carried on working. She sort of tried to pretend that it didn't happen because it's easier just to pretend that it didn't happen. She wanted to be brave. She didn't want to see it for what it was. So she just thought, that was horrific. Just going to put that in a box over there and leave it. And it wasn't until about a year later that she went home and spent some time with family that it just kind of all crashed on her like a wave.
Yeah.
And that happened to quite a few other women that I spoke to as well. Or we'd be talking and the women that didn't make it into the piece and then say something like, yeah, and then I was pretending to be asleep in the room and he had sex with me while I was pretending to be asleep. And when you're interviewing victims and survivors of sexual violence, you can't say, oh, so you were raped. That's so traumatizing. That's for a psychotherapist to do. But they couldn't call it what it was. And I obviously wasn't going to call it what it was. That would just destroy them. Often they would say things like that. And I'd be thinking, that's serious criminal violence, sexual violence. And I think picking up from what you were both saying earlier, in terms of the reporting process, and I mean, people need women like you two who understand the complexities of the industry and who understand, people who work in the industry do not need me. People outside the industry do as a way in, but people inside of the industry need people like you who they can call or they can FaceTime and say, this thing happened and you guys get it and you guys get why that might be awkward to bring up and you understand the best way to do it. Like if they spoke to an HR manager in my office, they'd say, do X, Y, and Z, but that wouldn't apply to yachting. It wouldn't work. They don't get it. So they are really, really in need of the people who had recovered had spoken to women like you and used your help.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is that the psychological damage that is done as a result of the harassment and assault. Are you worried about the baboon, Sandra?
And I'm always worried about the baboons because they were on the roof.
It's just absolutely harrowing. And the work that is required to recover and heal from that. Like my one client, I've seen her once a week for a year, literally. And there's just so much more work to be done. And it's about also going to someone that you feel comfortable and safe in talking about these issues. And I think, yeah, it's really difficult to speak to someone that you don't feel safe to talk to or feel trusted. And this is what Sandra and I were discussing the other day is, training the pursers so that they can deliver mental health first aid and then refer on. So I think that would actually close the gap and break their ice in terms of making a report.
Absolutely. I mean, for me, I'm very passionate about the fact that the captain is usually seen as the HR person on board. If you have an issue, you go to head of department and then the captain. But a lot of the time, especially if you are a woman, so the majority of captains are men. And at the end of the day, you might not, as a woman, feel comfortable speaking to a man. And that's not to say that there aren't very many wonderful male captains. I have worked with some absolutely amazing male and female colleagues. And it's just, again, for me, I would probably feel more comfortable speaking to women. Now, I've had my own counseling in my own personal life that happened not from on the yacht. And I feel more comfortable going to a female doctor rather than a male doctor. And that's just me. So I understand that a lot of women wouldn't feel comfortable raising those issues with their captain. So for me, the purser is kind of perfectly situated to be that on-board person who, even if it's not, the purser's not trained, nobody in yachting is trained in HR. And I think that's the biggest issue. And it's not to say that there's no HR department on board. It's the management company, you've got the DPA, but again, the DPA is not really an HR manager. It does a lot of the admin work. So even for me, I'm not trained in HR. I'm not qualified to provide counseling to somebody, but I am able to send them onwards to somebody if they do need to speak to somebody. Now, I did an interview recently with a fantastic purser. She runs an amazing program. She's been there she's been with the owner for a very, very long time. And one of the big things that she said that she's done is for their health insurance, right? So you have medical insurance. She's managed to get a package that crew have access to a counselor, so they don't need to go through anybody on board. They have a number that they can call. It's completely free for them, and they are able to get some assistance in terms of just counseling if they need it. And I think that's also a big thing, because again, for me, just working on board, being really stressed out, I've been so stressed and needed and you can't say to the captain, oh, I'm feeling overwhelmed and overworked and anxious, because then they're like, oh, maybe you can't do your job properly, right? Now, I have been described as clinically organized, so I don't feel like there's like a competence issue, but again, the workload that is required on board is very hefty. So that's combined with the assault or the harassment. And part of the big problem is I think that people don't understand what is harassment, what is bullying. Yes, you understand that if somebody is raped, that is an actual crime, right? But what is harassment? What is bullying? What constitutes it? So there's a lot of literature that has been published within the industry, and there's one that's by the International Chamber of Shipping and International Transport Workers Federation with guidance on eliminating shipboard harassment and bullying. Now, in it, they talk about things that, do you harass or bully other seafarers? You might not have even been aware of it. There's some things in there that perhaps I was guilty of when I was a crew member, that my personality type, I don't need pieces of thank yous. I'm very straightforward. I'm very much da-da-da-da-da. But understanding that not everybody is like me, and perhaps the way in which I was giving feedback was a form of harassment as well. So one of the things, you consider that your way of doing a job is always right. Do you raise your voice at others? Are you sarcastic, patronizing? These are smaller issues, but I think it all comes within, it's just raising awareness on board. And I know a lot of men want to understand the types of things that women, and it's not, I don't want to just say it's a woman versus man problem, all right? Because there are also men who have been subject to these things too on board. So it's not to say that it's gender issue, but I think just having some kind of onboard training for the entire crew would go a long way to understanding just how to eliminate some of the behavior that leads to these things, as well as the other crew members being able to support somebody if an incident does occur. And so, yeah, I think education really is going to be the key.
Yeah, education.
And I think those small things, the little comments on when you meet somebody in a corridor, or the small things kind of make way for the bigger things. They sort of are the foundation. They're like the building blocks of the bigger things. So having worked myself also, which I ended up writing about as a hostess at a race course when I was much younger. And it was sort of, it's not the same 7-star service as on a super yacht, but looking after people with lots of money and it's their big day out and it's super luxury and la la la. You have to say yes to everything. You have to laugh to everything. At everything. Often male customers would sort of use you as like a sounding board for their own jokes to impress their friends. And you just have to sort of stand there slightly awkwardly and laugh along, even though you're kind of like squirming and want the ground to swallow you up. You have to turn around and you roll your eyes and think, oh, for fuck's sake. It's just, it's a lot. You've got to take a lot on your chest with your chest, right? You've got to just laugh along and it's part of the job. But that yes culture that comes with 7-star service then is carried on to other things. And where's the line? So like in that survey, and I was also reading this amazing woman who wrote a PhD on it as well. One of her case studies said that she ended up in the jacuzzi with the owner and all of his friends, and then they were touching her. And that had happened because one yes had led to another yes, and then another yes. And she didn't know if it's my job to say yes, when do I stop?
That's true.
Yeah.
And it's the same with the comments and things like that, is that if a captain feels like it's okay to say something to you and you ignore it, then that can become bigger further down the line. So the little comments are important. They feel pathetic and people think that people are making a fuss by bringing them up, but they really, really are very important.
But you raise such an important issue, is that part of your job, especially when you're on the interior, is entertaining those guests. So as you say, laughing at the jokes. I mean, I've had guests get up and the music's going and then you're in the middle of doing something and then just take you and like pull you around and you're like, whoa. And it happens so fast that you can't say no. And then to say no is like, okay, well now, yeah, so and also just remember that your tips sometimes depend on this too. So it's like you're a monkey just dancing to their tune as well. And I know that NEBA, the Worldwide Yachting Association, are busy also trying to educate brokers as well on the hours of rest for crew, because the big thing is the charter time of crew. It creates a lot of strain and time. And when you're tired, I think your boundaries also, it becomes a lot more difficult to stand up for yourself and to say, it's just, it does become a lot more difficult to, your mental resilience is a lot lower when you're exhausted and you're tired and these things. So yeah, I think again, just having education all around, not just in the yachting industry, the yacht brokers, management companies. At the end of the day, the management companies want to please the owners because the owners can take their business to a different company. The same thing, flag states want to keep the registry under that flag because an owner can just be like, all right, I don't like this flag. Let me take it to a different flag where I'm not going to have issues or whatever the case is. So it's money talks. And at the end of the day, they are protecting their cash flow. And I think that's, again, where the imbalance of power comes in.
And that's why we need to know, like, I think to determine the vision, mission of the yacht, as well as the culture that you want to have on board is so important. And I think recruitment needs to be focused on that because of the pure fact that there isn't an HR body. So the yacht management companies either need to be educated or outsourced a HR service so these issues can be addressed appropriately. And I think everyone needs to be on the same page, and the captain needs to be a role model and go, you know what, if something happens, I will support you. And this is how we're going to handle it. And yeah, there just needs to be, as we say, psychological safety. And that's just so necessary in any working environment. So important. Well, yeah.
Sorry, talking about captains, it's a very difficult, they walk a fine line too. So just remember that their job's on the line. And at the moment, if you've got an MCA Master Yachts 20,000 gross ton ticket, all right, there are so many people with that license, with that COC. And the job market is really, really tough. So at the end of the day, the same thing, the management company, the owner can be like, all right, this captain is not towing our line. They're supporting the crew. let's get rid of them. Let's hire somebody else. So it is a very difficult thing. It's their job on the line too. And I think that's, again, just a very sad reality of it.
But then also owners want crew longevity as well. So I think once we start standing up for our rights and not taking on this behavior, they're going to struggle to find captains and good crew. Yeah. Gosh. Well, ladies, this is probably the longest interview I've ever done radio station. But it's been such a pleasure to have you both. And I think this information is going to be so helpful in terms of understanding what your rights are and how you can report it, but also to be aware that you're not alone and you do have support out there. So thank you very much, both of you, for being present at this interview today.